The beginnings of my testing on board the HB916 by Hope were a little bit troubled, and I was concerned it wasn't going to quite live up to the expectations I had for it. But after some perseverance, we got there in the end, so stay tuned to learn all about it in this review on theloamwolf.com. Let's go. If you've been into high-end mountain bikes for a while, then chances are you'll know Hope Technology. They're a UK-based company in Barnoldswick in England who have been making aluminium machine components for many years at this point, and all of them look incredible, really nice anodized finishes, and also perform pretty damn good too. Whether it be boutique brakes, some reliable hubs, or just about any other component on the bike, chances are you'll have seen Hope components at some point on a high-end mountain bike. But up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, they hadn't made their own bike yet. And they decided to change that for their bikes. Rather than just relying on machined aluminium as with the rest of their components, instead they had a look at what their capabilities were and found out that their CNC machining could also extend to the manufacture of aluminium molds for the production of carbon fiber components. They started off with a carbon fiber seat post and handlebars, and then they figured now that they've got their production techniques sorted, they can move on to a frame as well. They started off originally with the HB916. It was a standard horse-link carbon fiber enduro bike, and it had quite a few unique details to it. They decided, because they had the capabilities to make new components, that they could also make some new standards to really optimize what they thought was like the best use of the available space in the rear end of the bike. And yeah, it certainly didn't quite take off. I think some people were scared by the proprietary components that would tie you in to only using Hope on that bike for many areas. And yeah, it was maybe a little bit outdated as soon as it was released. The geometry and the overall look of it just were slightly behind the times, I think, once they finally got that HB160 to market. Now they've moved on to the HB916 in their enduro range. They've also got the HB130 if you're looking for a slightly shorter travel mountain bike, or even a track bike for the velodrome, which is a pretty crazy thing that I did end up working on at some point in my life. But enough about that. Now we have the HB916. They're on their version 2 of it, which was some updates rather than a complete overhaul of the platform, just to make it compatible with a T-type transmission drivetrain. And yeah, just some small refinements here and there. This is a carbon fiber front triangle, full carbon fiber, made in one piece. And then the rear end is a hybrid of carbon fiber, kind of tube sections towards the rear dropouts, and then machined aluminium lugs towards the suspension pivot area. This allows them to only fit bearings into machined aluminium areas, which typically give you slightly better tolerances and longevity. It also allowed them to get their bearing spacing nice and wide, meaning that the overall suspension configuration is as stiff and, I guess, structurally optimized as they could make it. This is a high pivot suspension design. It is a high single pivot, but it's got a concentric rear pivot at the rear end, providing 160mm rear travel, which is then paired with a 170mm fork and a pair of 29-inch wheels as standard. But you can also mullet this thanks to a generous flip chip in the seat tube up there where it connects to the rocker link, meaning that you can choose your preference of wheel size in the rear. That high pivot suspension design has kinematics that are tailored to hard charging enduro riding. It's got plentiful progression sitting around about 26%, meaning it's very much coil compatible. And actually what I would recommend is running it with that coil, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. The idler pulley is configured in a way that gives you around about 100% anti-squat throughout the gear range in the sag zone, meaning that you've got fairly well balanced pedaling forces. And then the anti-rise, controlled by that concentric rear pivot, is lower than you'd typically see on a high single pivot design, sitting at around about 80% at sag, which gives quite a nice balance braking characteristic. It certainly doesn't firm up like some of the other high single pivot designs like the Deviate that I've previously tested. And yeah, it makes for a slightly better performance if you're a serial brake dragger like me. Of course, you've got that upper idler wheel, which you typically find on a high pivot bike, allowing them to control the chain forces on the suspension and prevent it from having too much chain growth up at the top. But also SRAM specifies a maximum lower chain growth, which the HB916 V1 was exceeding, meaning that you couldn't run the T-type transmission drivetrains on the original HB916. So for the version 2, Hope worked to fit the lower idler pulley on there as well, eliminating the chain growth, or certainly controlling it to a much more manageable range that the T-type transmission could work with. Other frame features you'll find are your classic internal cable routing with nice aluminium machined ports up at the head tube, no internal headset cable routing, as you'd probably expect from a company like Hope, who are really no nonsense. You've got a angle adjustable headset up there. This is currently in the slack position at 63.2 degrees, but you could flip it around to put it to a slightly more reasonable 64 degrees for, yeah, slightly better kind of all-rounder performance. Then there's that flip ship in the rear end that I mentioned, allowing you to change between the wheel sizes. And then you've got some nice rubber protection on the chainstays and underneath the down tube. And not to forget the Butty box, their internal frame storage on that down tube below the water bottle cage there, which uses a nice Fidlock magnetic buckle system. It's one of the cleanest and easiest to operate systems that I've used, and provided a fairly rattle-free performance too, so really nice to see. Taking a look at the geometry, and Hope relies on a H sizes system, H1, 2, 3 and 4, roughly equivalent to a small, medium, large, extra large size range. The size large, which we'll focus on here, has a 490mm reach with a 646mm stack height. The head tube angle can be flipped between 63.2 and 64 degrees with that headset cup, as I mentioned earlier. Seat tube angle sits at around about 77.5 to 78 degrees, depending on where you have it set in the height range, so certainly fairly steep, but not crazy. And then the remainder of the numbers are fairly typical. You've got 440mm chainstays on the small and medium, which then grow to 450mm on the large like I tested, and the extra large to offer some slightly improved weight balance for the larger sizes. And yeah, it's certainly purposeful enduro geometry, nothing crazy, nothing outlandish, but certainly geometry that everyone should be fairly happy with. Talking about the build specs, and you can get the HB916 V2 in a choice of either a frame set with your choice of shocks, or as a complete build. They do also offer a complete build without a drivetrain, which is slightly, I don't know, funny option, I think. But yeah, frame set is £3,795, or the full build is £7,795, as you see it here. Those prices are for the raw carbon frame, as we've got here, but you can also get a Hope Racing Green colorway, which is absolutely stunning in the flesh, for an extra £650 or so. Certainly an expensive paint finish, but I'd be very tempted to go for it if I was going to buy one of these, because it does look absolutely stunning. Within the full build, you can customize a few different things. You can choose between different brakes, between the Tech 4 V4 or the E4 brakes. You can choose either a SRAM crankset or the Hope crankset on there. And you also get the choice of an Öhlins air shock or a coil shock. I started off testing on the air shock, and it wasn't quite for me. It didn't quite work with this bike. They did say that it needed to be serviced prior to giving it to me to test. So I don't know if potentially there was still something wrong with it after the service when I was using it, but certainly I couldn't quite get that thing set up right, as we'll talk about a little bit later, but the coil shock proved to be an absolute pleasure. The remainder of the build's absolutely high quality. You've got an Öhlins 38mm fork, you've got a Hope Pro 5 hub on Fortis 30 rim wheel set. They're wrapped in Exo Plus tyres, which again is not something that I've really got along with that well, as we'll talk about a little bit later. Then the Tech 4 V4s on this build, and then a one-up dropper, the WTB saddle. All in all, this size H3, or roughly large, Hope HB916 V2 build, as you see it roughly, came in at 34.5 pounds or 15.2 kilos. So certainly a reasonable weight, but it's going to climb a little bit once you fit some proper tyres on there. Enough about the build specs, let's talk about the most important thing. How does the Hope HB916 V2 ride? So at the beginning of the video, I mentioned the struggles that I had with the HB916 V2. Hope provided this bike to me with the Öhlins air shock, as well as the set of Maxxis Exo Plus casing tyres that you see on it. Neither of which particularly got me stoked on the performance of this thing. With that air shock, as I mentioned, Öhlins did say it needed to be serviced before it was given to me. Potentially there was something slightly wrong with it, but I could never just get it to feel as supple and sensitive and really get it to take the sting off of the trail as I would expect a aggressive 160mm travel high pivot bike to be doing. No matter what I tried, from 25 to 35% sag, a whole range of different compression rebound settings, I just couldn't quite get the level of comfort dialed in. Now it's hard for me to say exactly if it is that shock on this bike in general that's always going to be a problem, or if it was just that particular unit. We'll err on the side of caution and say it's probably that unit, but it's definitely worth demoing the bike with that air shock before you decide to buy it, just to make sure that that air shock is going to be give you the kind of level of performance you'd be expecting out of it. As soon as I swapped to that TTX22 coil shock on there, I was a lot happier. It really, the instant change in sensitivity of the rear end was just so notable, and made for a much more pleasant time charging down the rough enduro trails. Similarly, Exo Plus casing tires just have this fragile and slightly more like prone to deflection feel. You typically have to air them up slightly higher than you would do a double down or a downhill casing tire, which I reckon slightly more fit into a hard charging enduro bike like this. It definitely took a little bit away from the overall stability and comfort of the HB916 with those Exo Plus casing tires. Of course, it does make a whole bike slightly more friendly just for long pedally days in slightly less crazy terrain. If you're going to be riding, you know, trail center, then potentially Exo Plus casing tires are going to be a better choice for you if you're going to be riding this bike there. But really, for a bike with 2 idlers on it, high pivot suspension design, you know, long slack geometry, 63.2-degree head angle, it deserves to have a shock that's taken the sting out of the trail, and it deserves to have a set of tires that are durable enough and provide enough traction to keep you comfortable and, yeah, in control when you're charging hard. So I'd say, for me anyway, coil shock and a decent set of tires, burlier than the Exo Pluses on here, are going to do you better. So obviously I started the test with those original components fitted to the bike, and that's why I was struggling. I just couldn't get, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get the level of performance, capability, comfort, stability out of this bike that I expected to get from it. And it was just leaving me a little bit disappointed. Now, as that stock tire and shock spec they were giving me quite enjoyable characteristics for, you know, trail center, more bike parky style riding, absolutely. So it wasn't all lost, but yeah, for me, as soon as I changed out the tires, changed out the shock, made it a little bit more enduro, rough terrain focused, it was a much more enjoyable bike to test. And I did get there eventually. Regardless of whether the coil shock and the burly tires were on there or not, the HB916 V2 is a solid climber for a high pivot enduro bike. It's not quite as sprightly as some of the lower pivot, lighter weight overall bikes out there, that's for sure. But as high pivots go, it definitely holds its own. It's definitely no slouch for the bigger pedally days. The idler wheel, or idler wheels should I say, don't create that much drag, especially when the chain is clean and lubed properly. By the end of a ride, if you've let that chain go a little bit dry, you can start to get a little bit of noise creeping in, but I don't believe it's robbing you that much energy when you're pedaling. It's certainly not enough to make you really feel like you're pedaling through treacle or anything like that. The suspension performance, anti-squat on there is decent. It's definitely on the slightly more comfortable side than just a super firm and super racy feeling efficient pedaling platform. But in my mind, that's quite a good thing. It means you can just rely on having a lockout lever on the shock if you do just want ultimate efficiency on smoother terrain. And it means that the rear end can still keep on moving and then kind of adapting to the terrain and keeping you a little bit more comfortable in the saddle. So I think Hope has done a good job at balancing the pedaling support there. It's definitely not a horrible, like super soggy bike to pedal. And the climbing geometry as well also puts you in a good place. The seat tube angle saddle is in a good position, keeping you nicely centered in the bike. And it means you can just kind of switch off and spin the legs and yeah, pedal as if it was any kind of enduro bike, not necessarily a high pivot one. On the way down the hill, once the bike was set up a little bit more appropriately, this thing is an absolute ripper. It really charges hard. The high pivot is not insanely high, so it means that it doesn't have the most kind of pointed characteristics compared to some of the super high pivot bikes out there. It's just slightly better managed overall. That means that it isn't necessarily absolutely the most terrain ironing bike out there, but it does a very good job, especially when you've got it spec'd correctly and set up well. It definitely lets you truck along. The frame is quite stiff, which just keeps you feeling nice and solid and reassured. But then the suspension does do a fantastic job at muting out the square edges and just keeping you in control and charging hard. Cornering on this bike is quite a pleasure. That 450mm rear end is obviously quite long. It gets a little bit longer as you go into the travel, but it's not insane, and the amount of growth as you compress through a corner is not notably detrimental to the performance. Whether you're on flat turn or a berm, it keeps you nicely centered in between the bike, and you can really just grip it and rip it, and yeah, certainly pushes bike hard through the turns. In terms of end of stroke reserves, 26-27% progression, a nice bottom out bumper on the coil shock and plenty of compression damping on there means that you do keep off of it for all but the absolute hardest of hits. Talking about the rest of the spec, and I mean, Hope components are generally just really dependable and solid. All of this has not been any exception to that. I like the Tech 4 V4 brakes a lot. The wheels have been absolutely solid. You can't really go wrong with a, aluminium durable crankset. And all the bearings have held up pretty well too. I mean, it's only been a month of fairly regular riding. For this test, it's not been a super extensive, half a season or a whole season long review. It's certainly been long enough though to get this bike muddy and washed quite a few times. And in typical Hope style, it's just held up. It's been no nonsense. And I really think that the overall finish of not only the frame, but the overall components on this full build are going to stand up to the test of time really well in typical Hope fashion. Where would I place this bike in the enduro realm? It's definitely on the more aggressive side of things. It's going to be a bike for a rider looking to charge in some rough terrain, but it's not completely unusable in the bike park or on a trail center. It doesn't lose all of its pep. It still retains a nice bit of agility. So I wouldn't be too concerned if you are looking at it thinking, is this going to be a bike that I can only ride on the absolute roughest terrain? I wouldn't say so. It is still fairly well mannered, but it's going to really have your back if you're taking it to places like the Alps or a local rough bike park where you're really going to be able to test out its downhill capabilities. It is certainly a very capable machine, a very dialed machine, and it has been a pleasure to test once I got the right components onto it and the right setup dialed in. Just touching on the value proposition, I'd say for a UK-made carbon fibre frame with the attention to detail that this has, the value really doesn't seem that bad. Don't get me wrong, it's a lot of money. £3,795 for the frame and shock is definitely up there with some of the most expensive bikes on the market. But I mean, just looking at it, you're hit with a super high quality overall finish. All the details are really well covered. The down tube storage system is really neat. There was no cable rattle. All the components on this full build have been absolutely dialed. So I'm not going to ever say that £3,800 or £7,800 full build is going to be a good value bike. But certainly if you're in the market for a premium bike and you've got that much money to spend, I don't think you're going to feel like you've been ripped off for spending all that money on the Hope HB916 V2. It's certainly a very high quality product. I hope you guys have enjoyed checking out this review on the Hope HB916 V2. It's certainly been a pleasure to test, although some interesting rocky starts. But once we got there in the end, it's stacked up to be one of the highest performing enduro bikes on the market without a doubt. If you've enjoyed this video, then give us a like, leave us a comment and let us know what other bikes you want us to test and what your thoughts are on the HB916 V2, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out more awesome content on awesome bikes like this. Thank you for watching. Catch you out on the trails.